Good evening, everyone. I am Lindsay Smith, your host of the Agronomists, and it's sort of not fair, but producer Jay was making me laugh just before we went live. So thanks, producer Jay. Um, Lots of fun lined up for tonight. Hats off to Viren, who was actually first commenting. And now I don't know where John is, but hey, way to go, bud. Okay, and shout out to my Ontario Soil Network friends who are on tonight. So Warren is here, Farmer Schneck. I also see Patrick Berkeley is here. And so that's exciting. I did zip out a message to everybody to have them hop on and have some great questions lined up for our guests tonight. So we are going to be talking intercropping and relay cropping. And I cannot wait to have this conversation. But before I bring in my guest, oh, sorry. Hi, Mel. Hello. Yes, Mel Limas is here too. Okay, before we get rolling, I do want to remind everyone if you collect CEU credits, you do qualify for watching tonight. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning. Make sure you let us know that you've watched and grab those CEU credits. All right. And yes, Manitoba is here. Jason Fote, I see, is here. Francois Tardif is here as well. Scott Gillespie. So great group already online. So I do want to remind everybody, of course, this is an interactive show. Get your questions in early, and maybe I will get to all three clips tonight. Probably not. Okay, bringing in our guests, we've got Eric Page with AFC out of Harrow and Michelle Hubbard out of AFC Swift Current. Welcome here.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi. All right. Okay, so this is always a challenge in when we're trying to choose topics for the agronomists is making sure that there is an east and a west sort of side to some of these topics. And this is one that I am just so pleased that it is not just happening, you know, east and west, but there is so much interest in these practices in east and west. And so thank you to both of you for being here tonight, for agreeing to do this, and getting some of the questions thrown at you tonight. I promise it's going to be fun. Okay. So please, everyone in the comments, be nice. Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of an update, of course, or a bit of a description of what it is that you do, each of you, in your work. And I want to start out with the very basics and define some of these terms. So Eric, I'll start with you. You, of course, do some work in relay cropping. So what exactly does that mean? And what is the work you've been doing there?
Okay, yeah. So relay intercropping essentially is the growth of two crops intertwined, I guess. Like if you can think of it as a braid, basically. So you would start with a winter crop that would be seeded in the fall. That would progress into spring, and then when conditions were permissive, you would come in and you would seed your spring, summer annual crop. And so the two of them would grow together for a period of time up until the maturation of the winter crop. Then the winter crop is harvested, leaving the spring summer crop to fill out and mature and then be harvested in the autumn. What was the second part of the question?
So what now this will be difficult to sum up because of course you do a lot of different things. We can cover some of them.
Oh, what do I
But
do?
what
Yeah.
yeah, what do you do with relay crops here in Ontario?
Right. So right now I'm involved in a project through AFC called the Ontario Living Labs. It is a national project that have living labs in soon to be all the provinces. Ontario was one of the first four, the last of the first four. And I guess we've been up and running for 2 years now. And the focus of this project is really to work on farm with farmers on their innovations that are of interest to them. And so in this particular case, I'm working with Greg Vermeesh, so Van Meer Farms out of, let's say, Tilsonburg, although I know that's not exactly where he is. So this past year, Greg put in a winter barley soybean intercrop comparison with double crop. And so we've been working on that with him. And then, hi, Woody, how you doing? Woody's also a part of, lots of Ontario Living Labs people here. The other bit of intercropping that I'm going to be doing is a project that's being supported by Grain Farmers of Ontario and the canola growers looking at relay intercropping of winter canola and soybeans. And so that's with Francois Tardif, who's also here. And that's going to be at basically 4 sites ranging from Guelph to Harrow next year. So it was seeded this fall. It was just the first year of the trial.
Okay. Sorry, Warren corrects me. It's living lab, apparently not
Sorry.
labs. It is not
Yes.
plural. I said
Yeah.
labs, so my bad.
No.
So sorry, AFC and all. All right, now, so Michelle, you work with intercropping out west, and it's a little different than relay cropping. So how is intercropping different than relay cropping?
Intercropping is planting both crops at the same time and harvesting them at the same time. Though I'd actually consider real like they overlap. Relay I would call relay cropping a form of intercropping. But the projects that I work with, the one I've been working with the longest is chickpea flax intercropping. Um, and that's a good one for Saskatchewan, and especially for the area of Saskatchewan where I'm based in the southwest, which is really chickpea country. So it makes a lot of sense to be doing it in my area. And then we also have sites kind of spread out throughout Saskatchewan to get into areas where chickpea wouldn't normally make a lot of sense to grow. But with intercropping, there's a good possibility that it would make more sense. Um, so that's very interesting. And then my role is as a pathologist, so studying plant diseases. And that's from that point of view, I'm really excited about chickpea flax intercropping because chickpea is the biggest limitation to growing chickpea is ascochyta blight, a fungal disease, and it's a really tough one to deal with and is often dealt with through many fungicide applications in a single season. And that gets expensive and insensitivity develops to those fungicides. So I'm really excited about the possibility that intercropping could help reduce the disease severity and reduce the need for fungicides in chickpea.
This is so exciting. We're already getting into the why of these things. In that beyond it just looking cool and it being something different. I mean, there has to be a driving reason why. I will refrain from coming up with a cute nickname for chickpea flax intercrop, although I have several for other intercrops. So we'll just save that for later. But now, but you've alluded to some of these things, Michelle. I do want to delve deeper into some of the disease questions for sure on using a pulse and an oil seed in together. But Eric, from the perspective here in Ontario, um, what is the driver? What is the main sort of benefit that is being looked at as sort of why we would want to do a relay crop or an intercrop?
Yeah. So in Ontario, it comes down to, well, I would say it's increasing primary productivity, and the way you would do that here in Ontario, in particular, is taking advantage of the fact, as opposed to maybe in Western Canada when we have harsher winters there, that we can grow winter crops in a large part of Ontario. So we can farm the shoulders. And when it comes down to primary productivity, it's all about number of days of maximum interceptance of solar radiation. So you have a full canopy there for as many days as you possibly can. And relative to monocropping, that's where relay intercropping allows you to squeeze out a little bit more of the growing season.
Okay. Now we've already got a question in um, on performance of the chickpea flax intercrop this year. And so, Michelle, you did send along quite a few slides that we can maybe get to some of those, but it is a great question. So Warren asked, did the chickpea flax perform better or worse in a drought than a monocrop? So do you have preliminary information from the 2021 growing season as far as how some of these intercrops did?
Uh, Basically, they did about the same. Like in because it was so dry, there was very minimal disease. Like we did spend a lot of time looking for disease, and we found some, but it was not at a level where it would really have done the crop any harm. Which isn't surprising because it was just so dry and so hot. And then based on 2019 results, which was also very dry, the LERs, like the land equivalency ratios, which is basically an assessment of whether you're making better use out of your land by growing an intercrop as compared to a monocrop in terms of yield. So the yield from the intercrops and the monocrops that was about the same, like the LER value. So if you have an LER value of 1, you're kind of exactly breaking even. You're getting about the same yield as you would from growing like 50, just using 50% of the land for chickpea and 50% of the land for flax. And if you have an LER value below 1, then you're losing yield by doing an intercrop. And if you have a value above 1, you're gaining yield, or what's called over yielding. And so in 2019, the land equivalency ratios were pretty close to 1. And we haven't got around to analyzing the data yet from this year, so I'm not sure, but it may well be the same, that it's just so dry. So the two benefits are disease management, and then chickpeas also are indeterminate in how they grow, so they can stay green for a really long time if there's moisture. But there wasn't moisture, so we don't really have that benefit. So my guess is that there won't be a penalty for trying intercropping, but that there won't be a yield benefit either, at least for the chickpea flax.
Mm-hmm. And yes, we do have, as I suspected, we have some names coming in, and I'm sure, Michelle, you can let us know if we're off base here. I personally really do like some of these that are coming in on what you would name, and Flickpea is my favorite. So good job, Lara. I will say that I quite like lentil and mustard, because then you can call it lustard. But anyway, I have a whole list, I'll have you know. So anybody who wants that list, just let me know. Okay, so now I do want to get to, I am endeavoring to get to some of our clips tonight. We do have 3. I did choose them, so I do want to play some of them because, of course, part of this big discussion is exactly that: disease control, it's fertility questions, and it's why are we doing this, right? And are we going to get a yield benefit, or at least are we going to get other agronomic benefits but not give up yield, right? So producer Jay, if we can, I think I'll start with the Relay Cropping the Soil School discussion. I'm throwing a curveball to Jay, not going in order, with Mike Burnham out of Ontario. And so this is from a Soil School episode with Bern Tobin, discussing using relay intercropping for soil health goals.
I want to talk a little bit about soil, but first of all, hey, let's talk about the farm and the operation. Give us a snapshot.
Sure. So our farm is a mixed operation. We've got a cash crop operation with myself and my father. We grow corn, soybeans, and wheat, and some hay for my sister's horse barn. We also have a horticultural side of the farm with the farm market, where we grow apples, strawberries, raspberries, pumpkins, sweet corn, etc.
Keeps you busy.
Very busy, yeah.
So Mark, tell us about the soil. Tell us about the profile and maybe some of the opportunities and challenges with your soil.
Sure. So on our home farm here, we have a silt loam soil with either a sandy loam base or a clay base. Our main issue here is drainage. So back in the 80s, Dad tile drained all the farms, so sort of solved that. But on some of our rented ground, we have lighter soils, and topography and drainage is also an issue up there.
Mark, you're a member of the Ontario Soil Network. Soil health, big issue, something you guys are promoting and working on. What are you doing on the farm to promote soil health?
Yeah, so number one thing we do for soil health on our farm is crop rotation. We try and stick to a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And following wheat, we are really pushing cover crops.
Talk about what we're standing in here right now, relay cropping. You've got wheat interseeded with soybeans, some trials you've been doing the last couple of years. Tell us about it and where it fits from a soil health perspective.
Yeah, so we're trying to promote more wheat grown in Ontario, and one way to do that is to get a better economic return per acre. One way to do that is to incorporate a second crop in it, and in our area, we don't have the growing season to double crop, so we're trying to make relay cropping work.
So talk about it. I mean, you've got, I think, you got twin rows, wheat interseeded with soybeans. You've had 2 years experience. What are you seeing after 2 years?
So what we're seeing, the biggest issue is moisture. Last year we had a really fantastic wheat crop and a really poor bean crop. And we figured a lot of that had to do with moisture later in the season. This year we had a poorer wheat crop, but the beans are looking a lot better, and a lot of that had to do with moisture at the right time.
And from a soil health perspective, it really is a lot about wheat, right? And the benefits that wheat brings to the field.
Yes, that's correct. Wheat really adds organic matter, adds a different dimension to the soil structure, and just the root mass below ground is really what we're after.
You got a lot of diversity, and I think Dr. David Hooker's done a lot of studies on the benefits yield-wise the other crops in the rotation are going to realize with that wheat in the rotation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Mark, let's talk about agronomics here. What's working? What do you think is going to work? You got row spacings to consider. Obviously, you've got densities. What's it looking like?
Yeah, so last year we tried different row spacings. We had 15-inch, we had twin row, and we had 3 rows with 1 skip row wheat, and all with 30-inch beans and 15-inch beans. What seems to work is twin row wheat and 30-inch beans. We just get more sunlight down to the beans to allow them to grow. This year we were all twin row wheat and 30-inch beans, and the beans were right up at the top of the canopy for the wheat. So that I think is the number one key in our area right now.
Yeah. So talk about, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 years from now. I mean, I'm hoping that you're going to find the right mixture, shall we say, from an agronomic perspective. Relay crops take root on the farm. What does the farm look like? What does it mean for soil health?
So keeping the wheat in the rotation really adds another dimension to our rotation. Builds soil organic matter, soil structure, and promotes soil health, reduced erosion and all that fun stuff. But the relay cropping also adds that extra economic bonus at the end of the wheat rotation.
Yeah, so you got healthy soils and a healthy bottom line.
Absolutely.
You got it. Hey, thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you again maybe next year, and we'll see how the relay cropping is going.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Apparently, Mark was Warren's best man at his wedding. So, Ontario's basically one small town. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so great questions have come in. While that was playing, I've got some of my own as well. Eric, quickly, because this is the kind of trials that you're looking at is the soybean wheat. Scott brings up a point. If it's about improving soil, why are we choosing soybeans in between the wheat and not doing some sort of cover crop or something like that?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. You have to use the time that you have. I'm going to take a wild guess. If Mark was here to defend himself, he might say something about economic returns of soybean versus that of a cover crop is going to be a driving factor, right? I think adoption of anything of that cover cropping is great, but economic returns always trump it in terms of soil health or its added benefits. So. That would be my short answer to that question.
So I would just hazard that it would make a great way if you were looking for fall grazing. It'd be a great way to get a jump on some major forage growth. So you could instead do something like a cover crop mix or something that you're going to graze after the wheat comes off. But again, you'd have to have livestock to actually make the most of that, or at least have livestock willing to come on over and do something with that. So I would say economics definitely would be the driver there. So there you go. Now, there is a question, of course, about fertility. So let's dig into some of the agronomics of growing some of these crops. Michelle, Francois Tardif wants to know, how do you handle fertility in an intercrop? Is it different than if you were growing the crops separately? So do you change that mix based on what you're growing?
That's a great question, and is actually part of the study, at least in terms of nitrogen. So in the chickpea flax trials that I'm involved with, one of the factors is adding nitrogen or not. And some of the thinking behind that is, well, of course, chickpea is a pulse and fixes nitrogen. So maybe it makes sense not to add nitrogen and let the nitrogen fixation try to make up that deficit and help the flax along. And Jeff Shano's group actually has a trial on chickpea flax looking at exactly that. where they're using N15, nitrogen 15 to trace where the nitrogen in the non-pulse is coming from, and finding that some of it is indeed coming from nitrogen fixation. So, and that's being done by Melanie Reed when I'm a master's student with Jeff Shano. But then to get back to the trials that I'm involved in, we've tried with or without nitrogen fertilizer, and found that nitrogen fertilizer for the parameters that I'm interested in, like disease, it doesn't really make a difference. But what I would expect it to do is kind of favor the flax, because another thing that we're looking at is flax seeding rate, and we have a whole range from very, very little to pretty much a flax monocrop seeding rate in with a chickpea monocrop seeding rate. So the more, if you add nitrogen, that's going to boost that flax seeding rate even higher potentially. And so depending on what your goals are, that could make sense or not.
Just quickly, did you choose flax? And this builds on, Lara has a question sort of about other intercrops, and I do want to go through some of those, but did you choose chickpea flax for a specific reason, as flax is the oilseed, as opposed to mustard or canola, for a specific reason, or just because they seem to work well, or why that particular combo with the chickpeas?
That's a good question, and some of the reasons to choose flax but this would also work with an oilseed, would just be the difference in the seed size. Like, that's super important with an intercrop where you're harvesting the two crops at the same time. For grain, is you need to separate the seeds somehow, and an easy way to do it is based on seed size. But of course, that would work with an oilseed too. If the chickpea is large, oilseed is also small. So part of the reason, honestly, is that at the time I joined the project, chickpea flax was something that had been found to work already, and there was already kind of a background information on like what types of seeding rates should we try and what types of combinations make sense. And then part of it is also mechanical reasons. So we found that the chickpeas help thresh the flax bolls and make the harvesting process easier. Um,
I wouldn't have ever thought about that, actually. So, see, Eric wouldn't either. So
No.
good. There you go. Yeah, these are the things we learn when we try things. Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. So years ago, I had toured, it was a pea canola crop. So same idea, big difference in seed size. The peas climbed on the canola, but that was the other side of Saskatchewan. So a different water profile entirely, which is one of the things we'll get to in a second. So, but Eric, I want to come back to you because Patrick, if you followed along on Twitter, Patrick and Facebook has some great pictures of his relay crop this year. But he says that he thinks his wheat got too tall. So what has been your experience in trying to figure out I mean, we're talking crops, sure, but then within crops, how important is it to choose the right varieties in these mixes?
Yeah, it's hugely important. I guess I would kind of pivot. I say in the relay intercrop for sure, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in looking at canola, because it is going to get up above that soybeans and offer that much more height differential when it comes to harvest. Anecdotal, from Greg's harvest this year, where he nicked the top of the beans, they were not happy at all and didn't perform well. So the height differential between the winter barley and the soybeans was an issue for him. How much variation is there in, say, a cereals in terms of height difference? I'm going to say not a lot within a species, although, some breeder's going to hop on here and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. What we did next year for Greg, with Greg's input and with Andy Van Niekerk, we sort of did a little redesign, and that's part of the whole living lab process is constant evolution or co-development. So we're going to have winter barley and common rye next year, just hopefully providing a little more variation in that height difference. A couple other reasons why Greg wanted to look at common rye. But getting back to your question, I guess I wanted to just talk a little bit about a trial that I didn't mention I was doing, but for the last 2 years, we've been looking at winter piola. So what Michelle has talked about at West, but here with winter peas and winter canola. And I guess to make a long story short, we went through probably 2 years and a dozen to 18 pea varieties to get the one that we were happy with. And as you can imagine with peas, there's probably a little more difference in architecture for choosing what phenotype you're looking for. But what we found there was, yes, phenotype makes a huge difference for making that successful. I agree 100% with what Michelle was saying about nitrogen and its impact on seeding rate. Those two things going together to choose your winner in your intercrop will ultimately make the crop work out for you. And that's basically what we've been playing with in that cropping system.
So you did manage to find a winter pea that you were happy with as far as architecture, survivability, all those sorts of good things.
Yeah. It was one that had been grown previously in Ohio. It's Wyndham. It came out of some USDA germplasm. It not only had the right architecture, it also had the right color and palatability. I think that would make it well suited to a marketplace in Ontario if we had a market in Ontario. And it yielded exceptionally well under low nitrogen conditions. You provide the environment for the pea to succeed, and the pea in that intercrop will succeed.
Okay. Quick question here. So Jason Vogt is out of Manitoba, southern Manitoba in the Red River Valley, and asking about relay cropping. What's been the shortest season or heat unit area in Ontario that you're familiar with, Eric, where a combination has worked as far as relay cropping?
That's a great question.
I don't know.
Don't know that I have an answer for him. I wonder if one of the other people on the chat will have an answer.
Yeah. So Warren, who is east of Ottawa, not far from where I am, he says that they have tried peas and canola in Renfrew County, which is about 40 minutes sort of northwest of where I am. So that is getting up there for sure as far as season goes, quite short. I would say probably pretty similar to a Manitoba growing season, probably a little bit longer, but I would say similar, Jason. So I would say that's probably the fringe, though. I don't know that I'd be pushing it a lot more.
Yeah.
And again, that would almost maybe be one of those ones where you'd be doing a forage as the second crop for grazing, as opposed to trying to get a soybean crop. Although this year, Eric, so many soybean crops, we had double beans that matured all over the place. So, but maybe this was a 1 in 20. I don't know.
And that was such a, I saw Warren's results on Twitter, just kind of mind blowing where he is. But I should also comment there, like when we saw Greg Vermeesh's relay crop, he was dead convinced that his relay beans were going to beat the pants off the double crop. And in the end, his double crop soys went 47 and bushels, and his relays were 38, which is not what you would have said when you looked at them. I think I was there, in August, I believe. So it was a very strange year. Not what he would have bet on at the start, and not what we were expecting at the end of it.
And what assumptions or what theories do we have on why the difference? Was it clipping the tops that they didn't like, or what do we think might have attributed?
So there's a couple things. Clipping the tops was one thing for him. He also got a really late frost. I almost want to say he was into June when he got a little bit of a frost. Yep. It was late May, early June, and he was on some really light ground there. And kind of in the lower spots, he did see a lot of frost damage. And sort of as you kind of went up the rise in the hill, those that were sort of up higher did much better. So I'd like to see his yield map at some point. I haven't seen it yet, but in general, I would say those two factors just, this was his first year of combining it. So I'm sure there's a learn factor, but probably those things.
Okay. Lots of questions for sure, which is so fascinating about this. And Michelle, this is one of those things where I think so. My daughter's 13 now, so I toured an intercrop at Colin Rosengren's on the other side of Saskatchewan 14 years ago, and I'd like to think that things move quicker than that, but I think that's about the pace at which that they do sometimes. And so I do want to go to a clip. See, I'm getting to number 2, everybody. This is like, woo, turning over a new leaf. Anyway, I am going to go to the second clip, which is actually a conversation with Kelvin Hepner and Lana Shaw, who does a lot of work out of Saskatchewan as well on intercrops. Because, we are talking about something that I think is gaining momentum for sure. But frankly, it's the research like the two of you are doing and that we're doing with farmer cooperators that really starts to answer, how do we do this? How do we best do this? What are the benefits? What are the seeding rates? What's the fertilizer rate? All those things that we have to figure out so that we can set farmers up for success in doing this. So one of the questions, of course, is how do you get started and what are all your options and all those sorts of fun things. So Jay, if we can, I want to go to the clip with Lana and Kelvin, and that'll sort of set up our next discussion on some of the options on getting going on this idea.
Lana, you've been doing, anybody who follows you on Twitter especially knows that you've been doing a ton of research in the area of intercropping on the prairies, and there's certainly growing interest in intercropping and cover cropping and relay cropping and companion cropping. Is that almost all of them? Yeah. For a producer looking to get into it for the first time, I think it can be overwhelming or seem very complicated. Where do you recommend a producer start when they get into it, first of all?
I think first off, right now, is to get on Twitter. It might sound strange to a lot of farmers that this is a way of getting agricultural information right now, but this is where our cutting edge is right now, where the producers and the researchers are connecting in order to share information. So some of the people that have taken an interest in intercropping have made a point of connecting with those farmers and researchers using social media. There are other ways you can do it, but that's one of the fastest ways of finding out who is involved in this. And also being able to see pictures of what their crops have looked like, or they'll talk about some of their challenges through the year, and for a lot of them it's bragging rights of look at my crop, and they're so excited about it. So you start to catch on to some of the enthusiasm and excitement that the people that are already intercropping have. So you are absorbing information over a period of time, and it might be this winter you make it an objective to absorb as much information as you can before next spring. In general, the advice that I've heard that I would give people and that other people, intercroppers, have suggested is to start small. Pick a fairly easy intercrop that's easy to separate and start with one field. And that's how most of these intercroppers have started. You don't have to commit all of your acres or a quarter of your acres to intercropping in order to start it. You can start with one field, and that way you try to learn as much as you can, have a plan before you start, have your separating equipment planned before you start, and then and go from there. Make adjustments for your local area, make adjustments for your equipment based on how things go after that point. But yes, for equipment and the crop selection, it's dependent on what you have and what your land is like. So what works in Lethbridge is not likely to work in Manitoba. Mm-hmm. That's okay. It doesn't mean intercropping it won't work. It just means you have to be more careful about how you're choosing your intercrops and how you're growing them. So there's no simple recipe on how to do it, but this is something that can be worked out. It's kind of like we're designing intercrops for specific locations. Mm-hmm. And yes, people can contact me. I answer lots of questions on this.
Okay. That was going to be my next question. Do we start with peas and canola or a lentils and mustard combo? But that really depends on what is best for your area.
Yes. So a rule of thumb that I'm going with at the moment is if you're in, let's say you're in lentil country, maybe you can do a chickpea flax, right? Normally you're not in chickpea area. If you can grow peas reliably, if you're a little bit outside of the lentil area, you may be able to grow an intercrop lentil. So there's So the area of adaptation for some of these crops does change a little bit as you intercrop them, but not dramatically so. So, Manitoba is not going to be probably intercropping chickpeas and flax, but it may change the area of adaptation by a few hundred miles. So there are, a number of options that people can look at. In general, yes, the easiest ones tend to be some kind of pea with an oilseed of, usually a brassica, because the peas are pretty competitive. A lentil, you have to be quite careful on the seeding rate of an oilseed you put with it, because you don't want to seed one lentil and get 5 back. That would not be, you would not see that as a successful intercrop. Even if you had a lovely crop of, say, mustard, you still wouldn't be very happy with your lentils in that case. So, I'm in the infancy of trying to figure out what are the optimum kind of mixes and designs for intercrops for various regions. But yes, definitely they're regional.
Okay.
I have so many questions, and there have been plenty that have also come in on the chat. And one of the things I do want to talk about is harvest, because that's part of the discussion as well, especially like this year. So talking about, let's look at the relay crop for a minute, Eric, but the consideration of harvesting. So if you're doing a double crop, you're taking off your wheat crop alone, you're getting your soybeans in, you wait till they mature, and then you were harvesting them in the last little bit. So you've got to account for some trampling when you're doing the relay. You've got to account for nipping the tops. You've got to account for. So what's your experience so far, at least in working with farmer operators on that, changing the mindset of harvest, and what are some of the pros and cons?
Yeah. I watched a video from Tim Boring, who I know is over at Michigan State's done a lot of this, and he said that one of the mindset changes he needed to or thought was important when thinking about really intercropping was just not begrudging the fact that you have to run the combine through twice, but actually looking forward to it. And I don't know how you get to that moment of Zen, but that was his take on putting a positive spin on it. So lots of challenges. Certainly the trampling one is one that I hear a lot. And I think really it comes down to just a realization that, say when you're coming in, you're taking your wheat off, you are going to trample the soybeans a little bit. They are going to bounce back. They're early enough in their growing season that, and there's ways in terms of the spacing as well, how you set it up. And that's really going to be down to the farmer and the equipment that he has available. But certainly something to keep in mind, that it's a little bit about thinking like controlled traffic, right? I mean, it's the same notion. Like, how can you do this in the minimum number of passes with the minimum amount of damage to the secondary crop? So, yeah, I would say it's something that, from Greg's experience, from speaking to him, it was a bit intimidating to start with, but come to next year's harvest, I think it'll be something that he'll be far more comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. And Warren points out that he was a little concerned about putting that old straw through the combine when he went back in to do his beans, but it wasn't an issue. So sometimes the things we, are a bit concerned about turn out to be okay. So maybe that is okay. Michelle, I have a question for you. Lana said something that I found interesting, and I wanted to explore this a little further, that she mentioned that, obviously thinking regionally is really important. And so as we talk about all the different kinds of intercrops and relay crops we can do, obviously you're trying to choose what is already well adapted to your area. But she did mention something about, that doing an intercrop can expand the region just slightly, maybe by 100 miles or so. Why is that?
Well, with a good example is the chickpea flax again. And so one of the issues with chickpea is that it needs a stress in order to mature. And if it doesn't get that stress at the end of the growing season, it might even flower again if it got rain at the end of the growing season. And the problem with that can be that you get a lot of green seed when you go to harvest. So instead of getting nice, uniform, mature seed, there's a portion or a huge portion of the chickpeas are green. But the idea, and so that's what limits the area of adaptation of chickpea in Saskatchewan, is that in Swift Current, where I'm based, it tends to be really dry, and so chickpeas are deep rooted and they get water, but eventually it runs out and they become drought stressed as the season moves along, and that is what we need to push them to stop flowering and to mature the seeds that they've set. But then in other areas, like where Lana is based in southeast Saskatchewan, it's just that little bit wetter. And so some years monocrop chickpeas would make it there, but some years it would just be really green seed. So actually, one of the slides one of the visuals that I have is a picture of seeds from one of Lana's harvests, where if we want to show that slide.
Jay, could you pull that one up? I think it's number 6. Yeah, I find this fascinating, the difference in seed quality. So yeah, so walk us through. This is green seed, monocrop on the left, intercrop on the right.
Yeah, so the top ones are just the way the assay was done. So someone would take like a paper plate or any kind of white. I think that's actually not a paper plate; it's a porcelain plate. But whatever, it's like a white background that's nice and circular, and go through and sort the seeds by hand and see which ones look good and which ones look green, and push the pile of green ones. So the majority are not green in these pictures. And then there's a little pile of seeds with green on them. And the green is not infection, but like non-maturity. Mm-hmm. And so in the intercrop, there's only a few of those seeds. And in the monocrop, there's significantly more. And the thinking there is that the flax is drying out the environment for the chickpea and helping to move that stress along and move the moisture use along and provide the chickpeas the push they need to mature. And then what's going on with the bar graphs is a bunch of years. And so like the yellow bars were IH is Indian Head, another site.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And so there was just no difference. Like even when there's all the different flax seeding rates from nothing up to really high. And in certain years and sites, like IH 2017 was a dry year, and so there's really no difference. But then in other years, like Redvers in 2017 and 2019, there's a pretty high percent of green seeds, like 13% and 17%. And then that drops off to not nothing, but much lower as the flax seeding rates go up.
Okay. That is fascinating. Okay, so that's sort of the mechanism there. So then I do want to stay sort of in this thinking though. As you mentioned, of course, you're a pathologist, Michelle, and we do have several pulse diseases that we worry about. Ascochyta, of course, one of them. But what do we know about intercropping as far as a benefit or a non-starter, or is it actually detrimental to disease development? Do we have a sense of if it's helpful, not at all, or a hindrance?
Well, I'd say there's kind of two categories to that. There's foliar diseases, so diseases that happen above ground, and then root diseases, below ground diseases that maybe behave differently. So in foliar diseases, generally, it seems intercropping seems to either make no difference if, say, the disease is relatively mild, or to help. And one of the possible ways that it could help is by making the canopy environment drier. So diseases thrive if it's a humid environment, if there's a lot of moisture on the leaves, allowing the spores to germinate and to infect. But which totally makes sense if you think about it, like if a piece of bread is going to go more moldy if it's wet versus if it's dry. And so generally with foliar diseases, the trend is intercropping tends to help. But then with root diseases, it's a different mechanism. So in Saskatchewan, one of the big problem diseases that I'm sure many, if not everyone, has heard of is Aphanomyces. And so this is a root rot disease that's a big problem, especially for peas and lentils. And so I see there's been a lot of discussion of pea and canola, so pea brassica intercropping. And that makes a lot of logical sense that growing a brassica intercrop with peas could help manage root rot. And root rot is a really frustrating disease because there's just not a lot that really works to manage it.
Mhm.
But the thinking behind why this combination of a brassica and a pea would make sense is that brassica's roots contain glucosinolates, and these compounds, as they break down, produce isothiocyanates, which can kind of biofumigate the soil or kill the spores of Aphanomyces. So that makes sense and has been shown, like in the lab, that does work. But in practice, the trials that I've been involved in, it hasn't made a difference. So I do actually have a couple of visuals about that. I have just some pictures of what intercrops like pea canola and pea mustard look like. But then I also have a couple of visuals about the yield benefits. So what we saw was no root rot benefits from intercropping pea and canola or pea and mustards. So we've tried pea canola and then pea with brown mustard, pea with yellow mustard, and pea with hybrid mustard, and pea with camelina, but the camelina had its own issues, so we didn't really get a result for that.
Yeah.
But in
Jay,
any
I
case,
think
the theory makes
Jay,
sense.
can you bring up? There you go. There you go. Yeah, we'll bring up some of the
There,
images
so
for people
there's
to see.
pea oat, and then we can let's see.
Go
I
to
think
the pea
after the
mustards,
pea oat,
maybe.
the pea canola and the pea mustard. Yeah, so here's an example of a trial that includes both pea oat and pea canola. And then there's some close-ups of pea and mustard from another trial in the next slide. Just illustrating the different types of mustard that we tried. And then there's a picture of all the lovely root rot from many, many samples that my collaborator, Dr. Shamma Chatterton's group out in Lethbridge, spent a lot of time washing and rating and processing all these roots and doing molecular work on them as well, extracting DNA and quantifying that. And unfortunately, there was no difference in root rot. But then in the next slide, I think, then there was some yield benefits from growing pea and canola, and even pea and canola at different ratios. So they all basically, if we focus on the last column, the LER, the land equivalency ratios, they're all pretty good. They're all quite a bit above 1. So there may still be benefits of this. Like this system may still be worth doing, even if it's not for root rot management. It might, for example, prevent lodging or reduce mycosporella blight or reduce the need for nitrogen fertilizer or increase nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency. So there could be a lot of there, and one trial that has only had 1 year of data so far that I'm involved with aims to explore some of those things, like nitrogen use efficiency and where the nitrogen is coming from. Is it coming from nitrogen fixation, and are mycorrhizae needed in the transfer? Because, of course, canola is non-mycorrhizal, but oat, the other crop, is mycorrhizal. So if the transfer takes place, how does it take place? This trial aims to delve into some of those questions.
So many research projects. Now, okay, so Eric, seeing some of this, of course, In your work, are you using LERs as well? It's a little different when you're doing relays versus double versus. So how do you use a similar kind of measurement?
So I guess the direct comparison here would be the winter piola. So just the opposite of what's being shown here in Manitoba. And yeah, we are using LERs in that study.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
it's a little harder, I guess. I'd have to look in literature to see how many people are actually using LERs for relay intercropping. I think they are calculated, but it's not, I guess, the mental gymnastics on defining land use efficiency or land, equivalency ratios with overlapping crops and over 2 kind of calendar years makes it a little harder to interpret.
It is not Zen, as you said.
No,
That is not a
no.
measure of Zen, because my brain was trying, and I can multitask, but that's too much if I'm hosting and other things. So absolutely. So, but I mean, Michelle brings up some really key points. Yes, it comes down to yield, of course, because you have to pay bills, but there's
Yeah.
so much we're still trying to understand about how this changes what happens below ground. So what are some of the other things that in your work, Eric, that you're trying to quantify as far as, are you measuring, input differences? Are you trying to change fungicide passes? What are some of the goals of what you're working on?
Okay, do you want me to talk about just intercropping in general or relay specific?
Well, no, we can, hey,
Either or?
have at her. We have
Have
like
at
10
her.
whole
Okay.
minutes.
Oh, 10 whole minutes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll say for the winter piola, for me it is about nitrogen use efficiency and inputs, and so reducing inputs. Canola is a heavy user of nitrogen, and also just demonstrating that we have an excellent climate for producing peas and overcoming some of the challenges I think Michelle mentioned earlier with harvestability. So getting that pea canopy up, I mean exactly what Michelle was saying there. It changes the moisture profile in the canopy. It also changes light use efficiency. We're seeing outstanding LERs with peas grown with canola in Ontario in a winter cropping situation. Our problem is that all the pea production and all the value chains are in Western Canada. So we need somebody in Ontario to be interested in peas because we can compete with Western Canadian yields in terms of pea production. The other aspect I would say, like in the interest is, so like disease and say weed management. It's more complicated in intercrop. Mm-hmm. The saving grace of it is that if you can set them up so that you don't need to do it, you have, I would say, a fighting chance of not having to use those products. And so that comes into the bottom line. Are you needing to use a fungicide application? Are you needing to spray for weeds? I would say if you can get the balance right between your 2 crops in terms of seeding rate, which I think is criminally underexplored in terms of making a relay crop successful, you shouldn't need a lot of weed control. In theory, your peak canopy interceptance for that winter crop is going to suppress your early season weeds, and then your soybean has a head start, hopefully minimizing your need for weed control in that summer crop. That being said, I would always advise us having as many options in that soybean crop for controlling weeds. So, I mean, as much as we can run down herbicide tolerance technology and for some of the issues that it's resulted in, some of these innovative cropping systems are really going to be facilitated by having that tool in your toolbox, and using it judiciously is going to make these systems feasible. And so some of those challenges can be overcome. I would point to double cropping in that example. One of the biggest issues I find for my double cropping experiments has been volunteer control. And I don't know if any of the guys in the chat can comment. I know I've chatted with Brett Israel about this, and curious to know other inputs on. I find that in double cropping, one of the things that again isn't maybe talked about enough is you do have significant pressure from volunteers in that second crop, necessitating herbicide control. And I just wonder how that would compare in a relay crop situation. I haven't measured it, but just getting that soybean up there. Yeah.
Brett, actually, Brett, if he is still in the comments, I did want to ask. He had said that he favors double crop versus relay, and if you can expand on that in the comments, unless Eric, if you have ideas, do you prefer double crop to relay, and if so, why? That's the second part.
I won't speak for Brett. I wonder if it has to do with the way he manages weeds, where, you know, maybe he gets ahead of those weeds by getting in with some mechanical weed management early on after he plants the double crop beans. Maybe he wouldn't be able to do that if the beans were relayed into the winter barley. But I shouldn't speak for him. He'll comment on that. Do I have a favorite one way or the other?
Yeah.
I guess the romantic in me will say I like the concept of relay intercropping. It just ticks the boxes in terms of making the most out of a season if you can do so. From a practical standpoint, it's a heck of a lot easier to take off a crop and then follow it with a double crop right thereafter. I think that's what ends up trumping it for a lot of farmers.
Well, that's honest, if nothing else. Mel would like to point out not to forget about the PETA. Yes, pain in the arse. I use a different word, but the PETA factor for relay cropping. Now, this is one of the things, though, where Michelle, the West might have the advantage here because although intercropping, of course, does present its own challenges, it is, from the farmers I've spoken to, for sure, in some ways is easier in that you do harvest them all at the same time, but then of course you've got to have the plan in place to separate them after. So, what are some of those challenges, or is it a lot easier just to go into the intercrop? Have you found that farmers, and even with your plots and those sorts of things, that it's a relatively easy production practice to adopt?
Well, I've found that reasons I've heard for adopting it are most often overall economic. That it reduces input costs and reduces risk, and reduces risk in a lot of different ways. For example, if one crop doesn't do very well, you have another one to fall back on. Or if there's different areas of a field that where one crop is favored versus the other, you can make better use out of the land. So there's interest that way, and so much so in terms of reducing risk that, like, Saskatchewan Crop Insurance is working on ways to insure intercrops, but but there's a lot of uninsured acres out there, like people who just either the program doesn't work for them or they feel like, well, this is its own insurance. But then there's also a lot of barriers to adoption, and it seems to me like one of the big barriers is equipment, and the need, like difficulties planting, difficulties harvesting and separating the seeds, and this is just kind of my theory on it, but maybe there's a tipping point needed of that. If more equipment was developed that makes intercropping easier to do, it would be easier for people to adopt it. But unless there's a certain number of people interested in intercropping, there's not the demand for the equipment. So, so I'm kind of dodging around the question. I feel like is it an easy practice to adopt? It seems like there's interest, and I hear from people with interest, and we do have funded research on the topic. So it is being adopted, but it's not like taking off like you mentioned that you toured a intercropping field 14 years ago, I think, before your daughter was born.
Yeah.
So
yeah. But I mean, at that point, there was really no research at all being done. I mean, we have made strides for sure on the research, on the adoption, on what we know or don't know. But I mean, to your point, the equipment and these sorts of things. I mean, I know when I did tour that farm, they were growing canola and peas, and all it takes is leaving a load on the truck overnight once, and you realize you cannot do that. You must separate it immediately after it comes out of the combine, or else the canola fills in all the spaces between the peas and it's just a mess. Like, it respires. And so, you learn those hard lessons. And so we have people who have been doing this a while who have learned some of those things, but that doesn't mean that there's, a turnkey sort of operation that you could just hand over and say, this is how we do it now, and away you go. So yeah, there's absolutely still some challenges there. Although, so Patrick points out, equipment is only an issue if you're already invested in conventional equipment, which many farmers already are. And so you can start. Now, Patrick, I'm going to point out to everybody, Patrick is very smart, very clever, and very good at changing things. I am not that handy. So I would very much want the turnkey, like, just give me the piece of equipment that works and I will use it. So for all you handy people, I hate you. Anyway, I'm just kidding. And thank you to Brett. Brett did offer up some answers in the chat over why he likes the double versus relay. And so if anyone's following along, basically there, and Eric, I think you read it as well, but that the winter barley comes off, there's, no tillage, the beans go in, high-speed disc once. He spreads the straw, in it goes at 350,000 seeds an acre, and away it goes. And that some of the winter barley volunteers come up, and that's okay. I love that. See, that's Zen.
Exactly. And here Dr. Tardif's
Yeah.
giving me a hard time about my language of,
Yeah, romance.
I don't know about that.
And Zen. Come on, we're talking about biological systems. We have to get a little, in tune with these
Touchy-feely.
things. Yeah, exactly. This is really important. Anyway. Yes. And now, Brett, we should point out, Brett is an organic producer. So anyone who is following along, he was also letting us know what the premiums are for organic crops right now. And had I been drinking coffee, I would have spit it all over my computer. So I'm glad that it is too late for me to be drinking coffee. We are out of time. And this went by far too quickly. Patrick, you're not lazy on equipment. Don't even start. I have been following along. So don't even. Anyway, I am fascinated to see what farmers are doing to adopt some of these practices, to try them out, to see what they can do, and are willing to make some of these, I'm going to call them lessons, that are willing to do some of these lessons. And lessons, unfortunately, are kind of expensive sometimes, but we learn every year, right? So this has been fascinating. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Michelle, thank you for sharing of your experience and your knowledge and being willing to answer all the questions that come in. That really takes a special someone from both of you. And yes, thank you, Lara. I did get 2 clips in. I did not get all 3, but 2's better than 1. So there you go. Anyway, okay, so this has been fantastic. I feel like there's so many things. I feel like I have more questions now than I did when we started. So I'm going to write those down, and maybe we'll revisit this in a couple months. So thank you. And anyone who does collect your CEU credits, remember, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow. And we will be back next week at 8 p.m. Eastern, just like we are every week. So Eric and Michelle, thank you so much from me and the Real Agriculture team. And everyone who joined tonight, thank you for your questions, your comments. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me.